Sitting around a campfire, burning the remnants of a bookshelf now devoid of books, sat a tired crowd. Their faces betrayed their fear and exhaustion. Against the dim light of the sun reaching up from below the horizon, pillars of smoke rose from the collapsing city into a cloudless sky. From their seat atop a small grassy hill on the outskirts of town, people watched it burn. Not long ago, the city still stood. Not long ago, people lived their lives. The grocery stores still sold food, the banks still traded money, the airport still delivered people across the world. None of the survivors knew how it all collapsed, but that was the only thing they could talk about. For the first several hours, not one of them had been willing to say a word, but eventually the silence became too unbearable and, as humans tend to do, they found a silver lining by telling stories. "I was a fireman," began an ash-stained man, one of the last to flee the city. "The whole thing started out small. An office building had a minor fire, something about a copy machine overheating. We got there as fast as we could. The fire hadn't even spread beyond that one floor, but for some goddamn reason the sprinklers weren't going off. We hooked up the hoses and started doing our jobs, but the nozzles were all clogged and the hoses themselves were leaky. I'd never seen anything like it. They just fell apart in our hands. The boss blamed it on a change in the cleaning supplies. Some bureaucrat had some tied to some soap company, which meant we ended up with a truckload of toxic cleaning supplies that we used on all of our equipment. We tried to call the next town over for backup, but our phones didn't work." That, at last, was a complaint that the firemen's audience found relatable. They all voiced their frustrations at once. One woman couldn't call her parents who lived in another state. One man couldn't call his children who were staying with their grandparents for the weekend. Someone mumbled something about hearing about a recall of indoor sprinkler systems. No one could contact their friends and loved ones. No one said anything to keep the conversation going. It died out in sadness. Minutes passed. The bookshelf crackled and blackened in the flames. A weak breeze blew the smoke in a gentle arch as it climbed towards the sky. The sun set a bit further and the shadows grew a bit longer and less distinct. Nearly everyone wanted the silence to break, but none of them were immediately willing to break it. A loud pop from the fire startled a middle-aged woman out of her thoughts, enough for her to begin the conversation anew. "I worked for a cell phone company," she began. "I was in charge of making sure all the cell towers stayed on. I got an email earlier today saying there would be a software update and that we may experience up to half an hour of downtime. The update started right on schedule, and the towers shut themselves off just as expected. 10 minutes later, we were evacuating the city because of the fire." She glanced at the fireman and nodded. "I tried to cancel the update so emergency responders would still be able to call for help, but nothing I did worked. Eventually, the fire spread to the building next door and we had to run. If my building burns down, I don't know how long it's going to take to get the towers running again." She trailed off. This new silence lasted only a moment before everyone erupted in conversation. Some were plotting to return to the city and attempt to reactivate the cell towers. Some were complaining more about the loss of contact. One younger woman grew angry at the woman who had just spoken. She could have tried harder. Some were looking for more firewood. They found a dining room table. "We need to go for help," said one man, quieting the small group around him. "In the dark? In the cold?" asked another. "Well, we can't just sit here and do nothing," responded the first. "We'll go in the morning when it's warm." "What if it's too late by then?" The conversation ended there. No one knew what it would be too late for, but in their hearts, they all knew that it was too late already. They continued sitting in the quiet dark. Insects thrived in the bushes and grass around them, and their revelry could be heard well by the saddened many. The light of the two fires, one close and one distant, was enough to see each other by, but nothing beyond. The moon was nowhere to be found, but the stars shined their brightest, save those blocked by the imposing pillar of smoke. It was as though a piece of the sky was missing entirely. "I worked at a coal plant," started an older man, overpowering the young silence. "Every morning I would get up and drive to work, and every day on my way in I would see the train cars lined up along their tracks ready to dump their coal. But over the last month, the trains have been getting shorter and shorter. To tell you the truth, we haven't been producing enough power for the city in weeks. We've been importing more and more electricity from all over the place. The plant should be far enough away from the city to avoid the worst of the blaze, but it looks as though the power's gone out already. I reckon they ran out of coal and couldn't get any more power from elsewhere." Everyone looked toward their city. Sure enough, none of the buildings had their lights on. It was odd, thought a lanky college student, that they hadn't noticed the power go out. But they were all absorbed in their own worlds and their own problems. She heard someone mutter something about coal miners on strike up north. She remembered signing a petition supporting them. The bookshelf was mostly burned away. The only remaining fragments were so severely burnt that if the crowd had not already known what they once were, they might never have guessed. The table on top of it was still recognizable, however the legs had been broken off and tossed in the middle. They still held their shape but had lost all color. 2 teenagers had run off to find more fuel. They soon came back with a large piece of a wooden fence. No one asked where they got it. More people shared their stories as the night went on. A plumber employed by the city who had to deal with vast quantities of chemicals in the sewers. A teacher who noticed more and more of their students were having unexplainable computer issues. An electrician who noticed weird power surges at odd hours in the weeks leading up to the collapse. The closer fire continued to burn as more of the past was thrown into it. The more distant fire could only be seen as an orange glow, a false sunset. It grew and faded at intervals that could almost be called uniform. Around midnight, a smaller group joined the larger one after seeing the fire. Their arrival woke several people who had, against their will, fallen asleep. Conversation started up once more and quickly died out when they realized the newcomers had little information to share. Nonetheless, 2 groups became one, and one of the newcomers felt the need to tell their story of civil collapse. "I worked for the state government," began a short bearded man. "My job was to travel from city to city making sure everything was running smoothly." He gave a weak laugh. "It appears I didn't do a very good job with this one. Normally all I have to do is sign some papers and ask for reports, but this may be above my pay grade." He paused. "I was down at City Hall when I heard someone come running from down the hall yelling about a fire. I pulled out my phone to see if there was any news, but wouldn't connect to the internet. The fire spread, so I ran away. I was lost in the darkness for hours until I saw your fire. Along the way I ran into these fine folks." He gestured at a small group of exhausted-looking people to his right. "But they didn't have any idea where they were going either, so we wandered. Now we're here." As he talked, people mumbled their complaints about the cold, the dark, their phones, the fire, and anything else that happened to them that day. But there wasn't anything exciting in their frustration. They had each already voiced their complaints and heard everyone else's as well. Quiet soon retook the crowd. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the droning of insects. Hours passed and most people had fallen asleep in the grass with nothing to cover them save the clothes on their backs. Several people still sat around the fire watching it burn slowly through its fuel supply. No one had gone to get more since the fence, but the fence was still holding strong. It had burned all the way through in the center, but thanks to the wood stain, the edges still held their color. Those still awake said nothing to each other. They had each said what they wanted to earlier in the night, or knew from the beginning that they didn't want to talk. They simply sat and thought. One woman with bags under her eyes refused to believe the series of events she had personally seen unfold. She had witnessed the fire firsthand. She saw the firemen fail to put it out, their hoses unraveling in their hands. She was one of the first to notice the cell service cut out. She had witnessed the trains get shorter and shorter over time. It didn't all fit together. There were too many coincidences. Something had to be behind it all, but she couldn't think of what. A foreign country wouldn't risk an attack like this, and terrorists weren't well coordinated enough to pull it off. What then? White ash fell into her black hair as she continued to think. Her thoughts spiraled around each other, never quite colliding, never quite giving her a proper conclusion. The night wore on and nothing came to her tired mind. She woke up in the morning, surprised to see that she had fallen asleep. The fire in front of her had burned itself out. The city no longer glowed, but the smoke continued to rise in isolated columns. The towering single pillar that choked the sky was a fading memory, too terrible to have been real. As she sat up, she looked around the group on the hill. None of them said a word.